The iron came down slowly, deliberate. It pressed into flesh that had already learned not to flinch. A perfect circle scorched deep into the upper thigh, carrying the mark of a man she would never meet but would obey until her body gave out. She was 12 years old. She did not cry out. Tears had abandoned her long before the brand did. Beneath her bare feet, polished marble drank in the warmth of her blood. A few paces beyond, voices rose in celebration, citizens drunk on the rhetoric of freedom, equality, justice. It was 430 BCE. The golden heart of Athens. This was not punishment, this was paperwork. Ownership filed in scar tissue. They bought her for less than a measure of grain, and her body, like thousands of others, would tell a story the philosophers refused to write. A story of flesh turned into currency. Violence woven into law. Suffering transformed into civic revenue. A machinery so monstrous that Athens buried it beneath marble and silence, taxed it without shame, and never once questioned it. While Socrates wandered shaded colonnades speaking of virtue, while Pericles stood before assemblies proclaiming equality under law, while playwrights composed hymns to honor and the dignity of the soul just beyond those marble steps, the most organized state-protected trade in human bodies the ancient world had ever seen operated openly, methodically, without apology. And the most chilling part, no one called it wrong. This is not the tale of a fallen queen, not the lament of some tragic princess. This is the testimony of thousands, nameless, faceless, erased, women whose bodies financed the glory we still venerate today, whose agony built temples, whose screams paid for theaters, whose broken lives underwrote the birth of democracy itself. To understand how the cradle of civilization became a slaughterhouse for half its people, we must descend into the archives philosophy never opened, into the corridors history never lit. If you are drawn to the horrors buried beneath beauty, subscribe to Grimoryx, leave a like, and when you reach the moment that haunts you most, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Let us begin the descent. To grasp how this nightmare became ordinary, we must turn backward to the 6th century BCE, when a man named Solon reshaped Athens with reforms still praised as acts of enlightenment. Debt bondage among citizens abolished, political voice expanded, blood feuds replaced by written law. For free Athenian men, Solon's reforms meant order, balance, progress, but hidden inside that progress was a fracture. The freedom granted to some was built directly upon the absolute enslavement of others. Solon's laws drew a line around personhood, carefully, cleanly. Rights expanded inward. Outside that line, humanity ceased to exist, and no one fell further outside that line than the women forced into the sexual economy. The system was brutal because it was efficient. Girls entered Athens through 3 corridors of despair. Some were born into it, daughters of women already in bondage, inheriting chains before they could speak. Others were seized during wars, absorbed as plunder. But most were sold. Sold by their own families when hunger became unbearable, when debt swallowed dignity, when survival demanded sacrifice. There was no age too young. Records speak of girls as young as 7 being prepared for use, trained before their bodies had matured. Other ledgers note higher prices paid for those who had not yet begun to bleed, rarer, more valuable precisely because of their youth. Once purchased, they were taken to the ergasteria, sorting houses where bodies were examined like livestock. Teeth inspected, skin evaluated, obedience measured. The beautiful were sent to elite symposia where conversation mattered as much as submission. The average were assigned to harbor brothels. The sick, the scarred, the ugly, they were pushed into the ceramicus district where any man could use them for the cost of bread. But every single one without exception was branded. The pain was intentional, the scar permanent. The message singular, this body does not belong to you, it never has, it never will. Their owners did not call them women, they called them andropoda, man feet, walking tools. Under Solon's law, killing one carried the same penalty as breaking a plow, a fine paid to the owner for damaged property. There was no legal concept of rape, because in the eyes of the law they had no capacity to consent or refuse. Their only function was reception. Their only identity, availability. The Athenian state did not tolerate this trade, it organized it. Brothels required licenses, every transaction was taxed. Officials called a stinomoi conducted regular inspections, ensuring the enslaved remained fit for use. These were not moral evaluations, they were quality control. If a woman fell ill, she was removed until recovery or death. If she became pregnant, the fetus was aborted using methods that often killed her as well. If she aged or lost her appeal, she was sold downward through lower tiers until she ended on the streets, begging for scraps. Tax records reveal the scale. Between 15 and 20% of Athens' annual revenue came from the sexual trade. That money funded public buildings, religious festivals, theatrical performances, even the schools where philosophers lectured on virtue and the dignity of man. The same democracy that praised equality depended financially on systematic exploitation. The paradox was complete. Wisdom paid for in blood, beauty built on agony, freedom resting on invisible chains. And as if economic extraction were not enough, Athens went further. It found a way to sanctify sexual violence itself, transforming it into sacred ritual during the Great Dionysia, festivals honoring Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. Enslaved women were not merely used during these celebrations. They were offered living sacrifices in ceremonies that turned collective violation into divine worship. March 425 BCE. Athens glowed with torchlight wine masks. The Great Dionysia had begun, the city's grandest festival. Fertility, theater, renewal. Citizens packed into amphitheaters, watching Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides' tragedies exploring justice, fate, the dignity of the human soul. Yet behind this cultural brilliance, darker rituals unfolded. Ancient sources describe Dionysian ceremonies blending ecstatic worship, performance, symbolic fertility rites. Enslaved women and those bound to temples participated under structures that erased all will. For 5 days, Athens lived a disturbing double life. Art reached its highest expression, while religion justified domination, hierarchy symbolic human sacrifice. What citizens experienced as divine communion, the victims endured as erasure. So while tragedies about compassion played on stage, customs denying those very ideals were carried out just beyond the theater walls. The Athenian contradiction stood exposed. The city of reason sustained itself through practices that turned faith into an instrument of control. Yet even this ritualized brutality was not the most terrifying feature of the system. The true horror lay elsewhere. Because sexual slavery was not a side effect of Athenian democracy, it was its quiet economic engine. Every vote cast in the assembly, every speech delivered in the agora, every sculpture adorning the Acropolis, all of it paid for in part by the systematic suffering of women reduced to commodities. Fragments of tax records preserved on papyrus reveal the scale. In the port of Piraeus alone, more than 200 officially registered brothels operated, employing nearly 8,000 enslaved women. Each establishment paid an annual license equal to 6 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Every sexual act was taxed at 10%, collected directly through tokens sold by state officials. But money was only the beginning, because this system did not operate in isolation. It pulled the entire city into its orbit, and that is where the story becomes even darker. The system did not operate alone. It pulled nearly every layer of Athenian society into its machinery, not as passive observers but as active participants. Slaves built and repaired the brothels, cleaning blood from stone floors before dawn. Artisans forged locks, shackles, restraint devices designed for repeated use. Physicians performed abortions and treated venereal diseases, not to heal, but to return bodies to circulation. Priests blessed rituals that turned exploitation into duty. Officials supervised inspections with ledgers in hand. Citizens worked openly as pimps. Even free Athenian women sometimes served as overseers, enforcing discipline on younger enslaved girls they did not consider equals. No part of the city stood outside the system. Everyone knew where the money came from. The placement of the brothels was deliberate. The largest, most expensive establishments clustered around the agora, so citizens could visit them after voting, debating, delivering speeches. Politics ended. Consumption began. Mid-priced brothels surrounded the harbor, where foreign merchants spent money that never circulated home. The cheapest operated in artisan districts, where laborers and urban slaves paid meager sums for access to women already broken by exhaustion, illness, fear. Each tier followed a pricing system carefully regulated by the state, not negotiated, not improvised, but enforced. A night with a first-category slave, young, attractive, trained in music and conversation, cost the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a hoplite soldier. Second-category women were priced like a full meal at a respectable tavern. Third-category women were rented for the cost of a cup of watered-down wine. Those who were sick, elderly, or pregnant were offered free of charge to anyone willing to use them, framed as a public service subsidized by the state. A final extraction from bodies no longer profitable. The law protected this system with precision. Owners and clients were insulated from consequence, while any attempt at resistance was criminalized. A woman who refused a client could be publicly whipped to discourage imitation. One who attempted escape was branded on the face, a permanent warning, and sold to gladiators, where public violation became spectacle. A woman who struck a client, even in self-defense, could be executed immediately, without testimony, without trial, without record. Yet the law also imposed disturbing protections for the enslaved themselves, exposing the system's true logic. It was forbidden to permanently injure them without the owner's consent. It was forbidden to kill them without compensation. It was forbidden to steal them or use them without paying required fees. In other words, Athenian law protected sexual slaves exactly as it protected any other form of private property, not because they were human, but because they had market value. All of this unfolded while the greatest philosophers in human history debated justice, virtue, the good life, just meters away from markets selling human bodies. Socrates taught that wisdom began with acknowledging ignorance, yet never publicly challenged a system that reduced half the population to instruments of use. Plato imagined a republic ruled by philosopher kings, while accepting slavery as necessary to free citizens from labor. Aristotle defined humans as political animals, and argued that some people, especially women and foreigners, were slaves by nature, and that using them sexually was as natural as using tools to build. The contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. Athenian democracy, built on the ideal of equal participation among free citizens, functioned only because the majority of labor, physical, emotional, sexual, was delegated to people without rights, voice, or legal existence. The freedom of some rested entirely on the absolute unfreedom of others. And among all the enslaved, women forced into the sexual trade were the most exposed, the least protected, the easiest to erase. Most did not live beyond 25. Their bodies, destroyed by years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced abortions with crude instruments, and the psychological damage of an existence reduced to function, simply stopped resisting. When that happened, the system had already prepared for their disappearance. There were no cemeteries for sex slaves, no funeral rites, no mourning families, no names carved in stone. Disposal was the owner's responsibility, handled as cheaply as possible. Most bodies were dumped into the Barathron, a deep pit outside Athens where executed criminals, dead slaves, and animal remains were thrown. There, mixed with refuse and carrion, thousands of women dissolved into anonymous soil. Others were sold, even after death, to medical schools where students practiced dissections. Greek physicians believed the bodies of heavily used women offered better anatomical insight than those of virgins or respectable matrons. Even in death, their bodies continued to serve the intellectual progress of the civilization that had destroyed them. But the most chilling fate awaited those who survived past usefulness. As age erased their value, they were pushed into the lowest tier of the system, illegal brothels hidden in cellar basements where men paid with coins or scraps of food. Conditions there were so brutal that death was often a release. Later Christian moralists writing centuries afterward preserved fragments of what happened in these places. Women in their 40s, toothless and diseased, were raped by groups of adolescents as part of initiation rituals. Others, blind, deaf, or mutilated, were rented at reduced prices as defective merchandise. And even this was not the end of the system's cruelty, because what happened to the children born inside it was worse still. Pregnant women carrying children conceived by unknown clients gave birth in the same rooms where they worked, on the same floors, under the same roofs, sometimes between clients. So their daughters could be absorbed into the system immediately without ever experiencing a free childhood. There was no separation between birth and bondage. Life began already assigned a price, and throughout this entire process, Athenian society maintained a level of hypocrisy that reveals the depth of its moral collapse. The same laws that fiercely protected the sexual virtue of citizen women daughters, wives, mothers of citizens, imposing death penalties on anyone who dishonored them, simultaneously legitimized the sexual enslavement of everyone else. An Athenian citizen who raped the wife of another citizen could be executed on the spot by the offended husband. That very same man could violate 100 enslaved women in a single night and remain a respected, ordinary participant in civic life. The division was not merely legal, it was moral, and it was religious. Citizen women were considered sacred because their sexual purity guaranteed the legitimacy of citizen bloodlines. Sexual slaves were considered necessary because their availability protected that purity, redirecting male desire toward bodies that could not contaminate the lineage of Athens. Desire itself was not condemned, it was redirected downward. In other words, the virtue of some was sustained entirely through the absolute degradation of others. This logic reached its most refined expression in the philosophy of the age. Aristotle argued that the difference between a wife and a sexual slave was the same as the difference between a musical instrument and a work tool. Both were useful, but for entirely different purposes. A wife, he claimed, was like a lyre designed to produce harmony within the household and beauty in offspring. A sexual slave was like a hammer meant to satisfy basic needs without affecting the quality of the primary work. Pleasure without consequence, use without responsibility. And while philosophers refined these distinctions, while politicians debated justice and virtue in the assembly, while playwrights composed tragedies about fate, honor, human dignity, every day in every brothel across Athens, nameless women deteriorated, their bodies breaking first, their minds following, until physical death finally released them from an existence that had never truly been life, only function. Centuries later, when Christian emperors closed the last brothels, when the final sexual slaves died in obscurity, when the system that had consumed them collapsed into dust, the monuments built with their suffering still remained. The Parthenon, eternal symbol of Greek beauty and wisdom, had been financed in part through taxes levied on their pain. The theater of Dionysus, where the most sublime tragedies of world literature were performed, had also been the setting for some of the most systematic, ritualized sexual violence in history. Even today, 25 centuries later, millions of people walk among these ruins without knowing what paid for them. They admire the perfection of white marble without asking how much blood purchased it. They celebrate Greek philosophy without questioning how theories of human dignity were developed alongside the routine dehumanization of half the population. Because this is the truth history books prefer not to confront. There is no innocent beauty when it is built on suffering. There is no pure wisdom when it coexists with brutality. There is no civilization worthy of admiration when it reserves humanity for only some. Classical Athens gave us democracy, philosophy, theater, architecture that define Western culture. But it also gave us the clearest demonstration that humanity's greatest achievements can coexist with its most extreme crimes, and that the capacity for beauty is inseparable from the capacity for cruelty. This is not the story of a fallen princess or a queen undone by passion. It is the story of thousands of women who lost their humanity so that a civilization could preserve its glory. It is the story of bodies burned with iron so other bodies could be immortalized in marble. It is the story of voices erased forever so other voices could echo through history. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is written by the executioners. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Athens has been told by those who praised its greatness while ignoring its brutality, who admired its wisdom while forgetting its cruelty, who venerated its legacy while erasing its victims. Today, every time the cradle of democracy is invoked, every time the so-called Greek miracle is celebrated, every time Athenian philosophy is taught as the foundation of Western thought, it is worth remembering that this miracle carried a price. And that price was paid with the bodies and lives of thousands of women whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose voices we will never hear, but whose story finally deserves to be told. Civilizations do not die when their temples fall. They die when their moral contradictions become impossible to sustain. Athens was not destroyed by barbarians. It was undone by a system that demanded the absolute enslavement of many to preserve the freedom of a few, where beauty for some required the total degradation of others, where the humanity of a select group was built on the dehumanization of multitudes. And if this story has unsettled you, if something in you resists the hypocrisy that allowed wisdom to coexist with cruelty, ask yourself how many similar contradictions we tolerate today. How many achievements are built on suffering we choose not to see? How much beauty do we admire without questioning its cost? Because only when buried truths are exposed do silenced voices speak again. And only by listening to those erased from history can we begin to understand what it truly means to be human. If you've walked with us through this entire chilling descent, write remembered in the comments. Let us know you were here.